Welcome to Sunday Sermons from the Williamsburg Community Chapel, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Genesis, chapter 16, verses 1 through 16. And I'll be reading verses 6 through 10 for us now, as we prepare to hear from lead pastor Travis Simone, as he helps us continue in our sermon series titled, The Causes of Exile. But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur, and he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude."
As we hit this midway point through the fall, let me do a brief review. I've been seeing new people every week. It's homecoming weekend. I've seen lots of Tribe alum in the first service. So let me just catch us all up to where we are in our annual teaching focus on the biblical theme of exile. We are not at home, and we all know it. The American novelist John Steinbeck famously sums up the human condition with the phrase, "east of Eden." There are no people, places, or possessions that satisfy our longing for a true home. We all live east of Eden. A cosmic sense of homelessness pervades our lives. Now, the Bible explains rather than explains away our sense of exile. Every other religious tradition in the world attempts to explain away our sense of exile. It's an illusion. Or if you'll just install these pillars in your life, you'll make a true home here. Not biblical Christianity. The Bible acknowledges it, affirms that feeling of homelessness you have, and the Bible explains your sense of exile. And so this fall, we turn to the book of Genesis for the Bible's explanation of the causes of our exile. As Rich started our sermon series, he said at some point in our life, we've all asked the question, how did I get here? Or sometimes, frustratingly so, asking the question, how did I get here again? We've learned that sin sends us into exile, that sin feeds on our anger. We learn that pride blinds us to the only way home. We saw God call Abraham into exile. God called Abraham into exile to carry his blessing, the multiplication of God's life to humanity in exile. In the Bible, exile is both the punishment for sin and the vehicle God uses to save us from sin. Sin, anger, pride, calling. And today the Bible reveals another cause of our exile, a critical answer to the question, how did I get here? When it comes to the darkest moments of our lives. Look at verses 1 through 2 with me. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. See, this word, obtain children. Sarah says that maybe I shall obtain children through my servant Hagar. Literally in Hebrew is the phrase built up. Sarah says, maybe I can be built up through her. The last time we saw humans attempting to build something up was the Tower of Babel. You see, in Genesis, attempts to build up represent human effort opposed to God's commands, God's will, or God's plan. Remember, just a few chapters earlier, God has promised Abraham that he will have offspring as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And yet, it has been 10 years since God has made that promise. The Lord sure hasn't built me up yet, Sarah says. So it's about time I build myself up. How long can I wait for the promise of God to be fulfilled? I better take matters into my own hands. Her scheme involves a vulnerable member of their household, Hagar. Listen to the introduction Hagar gets in the second half of verse 1. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. Female, not male. Egyptian, not native. Servant, not free. Hagar is quite vulnerable. You might say Hagar lives on the margin of the margins. The sinfulness of the plan is exposed as the narrator uses words to call you back to Adam and Eve's original sin that sent humanity from the garden, the first exile. Look at verse 3 and see if you can pick up on some key biblical words in verse 3. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her Egyptian, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. Sarai took Hagar and gave her to Abraham. She took, she gave. This is exactly what we read in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve in the garden took fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Eve gave some of the fruit to her husband who was with her, and they ate. Also, here, Abraham and Sarah violate God's creational ideal of marriage between one man and one woman for life. That the other place in the book of Genesis that uses the word built is in Genesis chapter 2, where God made the woman and brought her to the man for the first marriage. That word for made that we read in our English Bibles, it's the Hebrew word built. God built the woman. He fashioned her. She's a masterpiece. And here, Sarai says, I will build myself up through this other woman. They took, they gave, they violate God's creational ideal of marriage. Just as Eve takes fruit that does not belong to her and gave it to her husband so they could obtain wisdom on their own terms, here Sarah takes a woman that should not belong to her and gives her to her husband so that they might obtain God's promises on their own terms. The results are disastrous. The exact opposite of what Sarah intends to happen is what happens. Look at verse 4 with me. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. That phrase, look with contempt, is the Hebrew phrase made smaller or lowered. Hagar was lowered or made smaller in Hagar's eyes. Remember what Sarah wanted out of this whole operation. She wanted to be built up, but instead, she was lowered. Now, I love that we worship together with our middle school and high school students now. And I want to do a better job seeing you middle school and high school students as I teach through my sermon. So right now, this is for the middle school and high school students out there. Something I learned a long time ago. I can't even remember who told it to me. It's been one of the best principles of wisdom that I've ever learned. It's proven true over and over again in my life. Sin always takes you further than you wanted to go, makes you stay longer than you wanted to stay, and costs more than you ever wanted to pay. And so as we all consider going our own way in life, remember, sin always takes you further than you wanted to go, makes you stay longer than you wanted to stay, and costs more than you ever wanted to pay. And you see, their plan continues to unravel in verse 6. But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. Sarah dealt harshly with her. It's the Hebrew word for affliction. Sarai afflicted her, caused her to suffer in some terrible way, and Hagar flees. She becomes an exile. In the very next book of the Bible, we see God's people in the land of Egypt freed from slavery. Here you see an Egyptian with Israelites sent not into an exodus, but into an exile. One biblical scholar, Phyllis Tribble, put it like this: departing her land of bondage, Hagar knows not exodus, but exile. Look at verse 7 and 8 with me. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to shore. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarai." I'm fleeing from my mistress, Sarai. Notice that the angel asks her two questions. Where have you come from? And where are you going? And notice that Hagar only answers the first question. Where have you come from? Why do you think she doesn't answer the second question? Perhaps she doesn't know where she's going. Perhaps she doesn't have anywhere to go. You see, up till now, the causes of exile have related to our own sin and God's calling. Here, what is highlighted is not sin Hagar committed, but sin committed against her. See, Hagar is afflicted into exile, abused into exile, used, beaten, betrayed, deceived into exile. It is suffering that sends Hagar into exile. Some time ago, there was a situation in my life where someone I trusted a great deal, someone who served in a position of authority, lied to me, deceived me. And it brought great havoc and chaos into my life. I know exactly what sent me into that chaos, and I had no idea where to go next or how to get out of it. And so I did as I've often done in my life when I'm quite lost. I call my dad. My dad's just a wise, wise man. And I said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about something." And he dropped everything. He came to Williamsburg. I told him what had happened. And he looked across the lunch table from me. I was wondering what he was going to respond. Maybe he can tell me where I should go. Maybe he can tell me what I should do next. This was his response. "I've always wondered when something like this was going to happen to you." He didn't say, "I can't believe this has happened to you." He didn't say, "This should never have happened to you." He said, "I always wondered when something like this would happen to you." For my dad, from many years of life experience, knew the truth that at some point in all our lives, suffering sends us into exile. Suffering sends us into exile. And everyone can identify with Hagar in some way. Afflicted into exile, abused into exile, used, beaten, betrayed, in my case, deceived into exile. See, suffering sends us into exile. And at those moments, just like Hagar, we know exactly what put us there, but we don't know where to go next. We don't know what to do next. We don't know who will take us in, who we can trust, who can help, or how to get home. Our passage this morning does not merely diagnose suffering as one of the causes of exile. It offers good news for those whom suffering has sent into exile, who hear the good news. When suffering sends us into exile, God hears us. God hears us. Look at verse 11. The angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction." Ishmael means God hears. El is the Hebrew word for God. Ishmael, God hears. God hears Hagar in exile. But I want you to take note of what God hears exactly. It's in the second half of verse 11. Because the Lord has listened to your affliction. God hears her affliction. It is not that God heard Hagar's prayers. It is not that God heard Hagar cry out to him. She just cries out in pain. And God hears that too. God hears not only the prayers of the faithful, God hears the groans of people experiencing pain so great that it makes them question the very idea of God. God hears every sigh. God hears the faintest whimpers people conceal while pretending everything is okay. When suffering sends us into exile, God hears us and God sees us. Look at verse 13 of our passage. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." God's care goes even deeper than hearing. God shows up and says to Hagar, "I have heard you." And Hagar then exclaims, "You are a God of seeing," or "You are a God who sees me." Everyone carries some pain around that no one sees. And I've been in pastoral ministry long enough to know this is true. And occasionally people pull back the layers of their life and they share with me what no one else around them can see. Everyone carries pain that no one sees. And Hagar's story makes it clear. God sees. God sees. God sees you. That's his nature. He's the God who sees. Perhaps you even carry pain around that you intentionally hide so that no one discovers what you believe is just too shameful to be seen. I'm here to tell you it's not too shameful for God. God sees that too. He sees you. He sees your shame. He sees your pain. When suffering sends us into exile, God sees us. And God finds us. Look at verse 7. And the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. In the middle of the desert, in the middle of the wilderness, likely some distance, possibly a week's journey away from where Abraham and Sarah were living at the time, where she thought no one would ever find her, God finds her. God does not hear us from a distance. He does not use a telescope to see us from afar. When suffering sends us in exile, God finds us wherever we are, wherever our exile has carried us. God finds us right there. Perhaps suffering has blown you so off the course of your life, so far from the course you mapped out for yourself that you no longer even recognize your life. You imagine you've taken so many wrong turns, you're convinced there is no going back. Well, I'm convinced that Hagar's story is your story. The angel of the Lord found her. Where? In the wilderness, in the desert. Hear these words from Psalm 139. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol or the depths, if I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost part of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. When suffering sends us into exile, God finds us. And the best news is still to come. God lowers himself toward us. I want to come back to the fact that Hagar names God. Hagar does not call on the name of the Lord. Hagar calls the name of the Lord. Now, in the Bible and up to today, the one who names always has higher status. Think parents and children. Think Adam and the animals. Think the rest of the book of Genesis. In just the next chapter, chapter 17, God will change Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah. A little later, he changes Jacob's name to Israel. God does the naming. He's the one with more status, more power. He names people. People don't name God. Yet here, and remember the opening description of Hagar, here a female Egyptian servant names God. It's such a radical moment. She is the only person, male or female, in the entire Bible who names God. Plenty of people call on the name of God. Only Hagar names God. God is majestic. God is high and lifted up. God is holy. He's a consuming fire. And God is also named by a lost, exiled slave. Let me push this point a little further. Throughout the story, only the narrator calls Hagar by name. Neither Abraham nor Sarah uses her name. Look at verses 2 and 6. They call her my servant or your servant, but they never call her Hagar. She's nameless. The one without a name names the Almighty God. God gives up status. God gives up power. God lowers himself. Exactly what Sarah was unwilling to suffer, to be lowered in Hagar's eyes, is exactly what God suffers in order to hear her, to see her, and to find her. I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I spent some time in Durham, North Carolina during my sabbatical. I was working on a writing project for which I had to interview several different pastors. When I got to Durham, I thought my interviews were over, but per the advice of my advisor, who wanted me to add a little more denominational flavor to the project, he set me up to interview a Presbyterian pastor named Alan Poole about the leadership transition he went through at his church. Alan Poole was the pastor of Blacknall Presbyterian Church in Durham, North Carolina for 37 years. He instantly had my respect. And after I interviewed him for the project, I just sensed there was so much wisdom that Alan possessed. I said, would you mind meeting again with me while I'm here? Could you meet with me next week? And maybe the week after that, I'd really love to learn from you as a pastor. He graciously accepted my invitation. And so we met at a little cafe called Mad Hatter's for a few weeks. And I dumped the truck of my life and pastoral ministry on him. Every hurt that I had experienced, any pain that I was holding on to, I laid it all bare on the table before Alan. I remember that first meeting, I thought I was just gonna scare him away. And Alan then looked across the table. I wondered, what did he think of everything that I had just told him? He looked me right in the eye and just said, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I'm so sorry that happened to you. It was such a moment of healing in my life. I want every single person here this morning to hear that. As your pastor, whatever you're thinking about right now, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And part of why it meant so much to me when he said that to me, because I knew he'd been through it all too. He was a pastor for over 40 years, 37 years in one place. I'm sure someone at that church hurt him. I'm sure someone at that church left him. I knew he'd experienced it all. And so when he said it, the healing just entered my soul. You see, for God, hearing us, seeing us, and finding us in our exile was not an intellectual exercise. God, in and as Jesus Christ, entered our exile and experienced our suffering. Listen to what the book of Philippians in chapter 2 says about Jesus Christ. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus Christ became a servant so that when we place our faith in him, we become children of God. Jesus Christ humbled himself. That is, he lowered himself. Jesus Christ lowered himself all the way to the cross so that we might be lifted up. Jesus Christ entered the ultimate exile of death that we might be brought home to the newness of life in him. And if you've never trusted in Jesus Christ to be born again into God's family, if you've never trusted in Jesus Christ to be made brand new in him, I invite you to put your faith and trust in him now. And you will see the God who sees you. Hagar's final statement in the passage is hard to translate. It's in the second half of verse 13. She says, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." But in Hebrew, it's a question. There's a little footnote in the ESV translation if you're using a paper Bible. The footnote puts it like this: "Would I have looked here for the one who sees me? Would I have looked here for the one who sees me?" After all that has happened in her life, and remember, she's an Egyptian slave. Abraham and Sarai acquired her when they sojourned down in Egypt for a famine. She was in Pharaoh's harem. Imagine what that entailed. Pharaoh's harem, a victim of sexual abuse. And she says, "Would I have looked here for the one who sees me?" It is in the place of suffering, the place where she never would have looked for God, and there God stands. Perhaps in the shocking places where you would never dare to look for God. The shocking places of your life where you are convinced of God's absence, maybe, just maybe, there God stands, lowered all the way to see you and for you to see him. Because when suffering sends us into exile, God hears us, God sees us, God finds us, and through Jesus Christ, God lowers himself toward us.
Thank you for joining us today. Here at the Williamsburg Community Chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. So wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we hope you will join us this year as we study the biblical theme of exile and learn how to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land.